All right. Good evening, everybody. I'm Carrie Potter with Family Matters, and you are in Compass Session 9. It looks like people are kind of trickling in right now since we've just started the webinar. Um, and Deb Einhorn is here with us to talk tonight, and we're going to be talking about research-based practices and the basics of disabilities. So, trying to get okay. It looks like we have 7 participants on right now. Abby wanted me to give you a reminder to do your UPL trainings. If you don't have those resources, reach out to Abby and she can get those links to you, but you should have those. And then, yeah, we'll just kind of go from there. If you have questions tonight, either put them in the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll kind of handle those questions as we go. So I think I'll go ahead and, for sake of time, turn it over to you, Deb.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to, I guess this is session 9 of your Compass training. My name is Debbie Einhorn, and I am the former Executive Director of Family Matters. I retired in mid-September, and so they asked me to present one of the sessions for you. And I was the person who worked with Megan Burke, one of our board members, to initiate this training on an annual basis for Family Matters. So I commend all of you for donating your time and giving up your evening for so many weeks to get some in-depth knowledge about special education advocacy. And so appreciate your attendance and hope that you will participate tonight by putting your questions in the question box or raising your hand. So we're going to get started with we have 2 PowerPoints tonight. The first one will be just some basic information about disabilities. We will look at the eligibility categories for special education, what those disability categories are, and in order for students to be eligible to have an IEP or an individualized education plan. And that will help you. Most of you are parents, and so you probably have intimate knowledge of your child's disability, but may not be so much aware of other disabilities. So if you're working with other families who have children with a different disability, this will just give you some helpful information for how you might best advocate for a child with a different disability. And then the second PowerPoint will be on research-based interventions, and then we'll have some scenarios to look at the end of the evening to put into practice some of the things we talk about tonight. Okay, so we'll get started with the basics of disabilities. So our purpose tonight is to give you enough information that will help you with some ideas on how to be a good advocate for students with particular disabilities. So in one sense, our task is to discuss these categories of eligibility for special education services. Those are what you see on your screen are the eligibility categories in Illinois for children to qualify for special education services. We're going to start with emotional disability. Emotional disabilities are, I guess you could say, it's an exclusionary disability. So when we look at children that have emotional disabilities, we first have to make sure that their learning struggles are not due to other things like intellectual disabilities, some health issues, or sensory factors, related to other types of disabilities. So we would rule those things out before we would look at an emotional disability. But some of the characteristics are the inability to build or maintain satisfactory social relationships. So peer relationships, ability to make friends, keep friends, have friends, interactions with adults, being able to have respectful and uh, collegial relationships with adults and other children. It might be characterized by inappropriate behavior or feelings that are not due to unusual stressors. So, in other words, their children that have emotional disabilities might become extremely upset by things that typical people can just handle in stride. It could be characterized by a general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, and it could be characterized by physical symptoms or fears due to school problems, and that would include things like school phobias. So the different types of emotional disabilities could include attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, depression, anxiety disorder, bipolar, or what's more often known now as mood disorder, and then phobias. Now, all of those things are medical diagnoses. So, a child with emotional disabilities is not going to be identified through a school evaluation. These are medical diagnoses, not diagnoses that schools can make. And so, probably in one of your previous sessions of Compass, you may have learned about the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requirement that schools can pay for a medical evaluation if it is needed in order to determine a child's eligibility for services. So if there are symptoms of any of these things and the child is struggling in school, and you're working with a child that hasn't yet been identified as as a student with a disability and isn't yet eligible for an individualized education program, then this might be an area where you would advocate for the student to get a medical evaluation paid for by the school district to determine if they have any of these things. And that would be a one-time medical evaluation that a district would be responsible for. Any ongoing, and then if the child is diagnosed with one of these things and needs ongoing medical services, those would not be the responsibility of the school district. But that initial evaluation to determine their eligibility could be something that would be required by the school district. Next slide. Okay. So, what is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? So, this is a disorder that affects anywhere from 3 to 5% of school children, and that is over 2 million children in our country. It makes it hard for them to pay attention and control their behavior. It's often diagnosed when a child reaches school and has a hard time in a classroom setting. So, you know, most toddlers and are distractible. They're have a hard time sitting still, paying attention. So many times children that have attention deficit disorder aren't diagnosed when they're that young because all children typically have a lot of those characteristics, all toddlers. So once they get to school, though, and then they're in a more confining situation where they're expected to sit in a desk in a chair, at a desk in a chair, or sit in a circle, cross-legged, and pay attention to the teacher and to raise their hand and to wait to speak and those kinds of things, that's when those characteristics might start showing up. It's diagnosed much more often in boys than in girls. And when we talk about, a lot of times we talk about how children with attention deficit disorder have a hard time paying attention. But really, it's more a problem that they pay too much attention to everything. They're not able to focus on one thing. So for some of us who are able to sit in a chair and listen to a speaker while we're ignoring what's going on outside the window or what we hear out in the hallway, a student with attention deficit disorder is paying an equal amount of attention to all of those things, to maybe the buzzing in the fluorescent lights overhead, maybe the lawnmower that's outside the window, and traffic that's going down the hall, and the fly that's buzzing around the kid sitting next to them. They're paying equal amounts of attention to all of those things and having a hard time focusing on just what the teacher is saying. So the principal characteristics of ADHD are that they are easily distracted by things, make careful mistakes, they're forgetful, they might not remember to take their books home with them from school. They might not remember to write their assignment down in their notebook. They might have a hard time getting through the teacher's instructions. So if the teacher is giving verbal directions to the class, they may have heard the first few words and then not heard the rest of it. And so they have trouble following through on the task because they didn't hear the whole set of directions. They may be hyperactive, on the go, restless, impatient, have a need to keep moving. They might be fidgety. There are types of attention deficit disorder that don't include hyperactivity, and that is those students have more wandering thoughts, and they don't have a problem sitting still, but they have a problem paying attention to a full set of information. They could have impulsivity, which results in poor decision making, poor judgment, because they may be perfectly aware of and understand a certain set of rules, but when it comes to applying those rules in the situation that they're in, they just act before they can think. And so those can cause problems. So some of the types of advocacy you would do with students that have attention deficit disorder, if they are having problems with distractibility and forgetfulness, they might need a set of one of the accommodations they might need and that you might want to advocate for is that they have a set of books that are kept at home and one set of books that are kept at school, so you don't have this problem with them forgetting to bring things home with them. You might, if they're restless and fidgety and they need to move around, there are all kinds of accommodations for kids that can be applied right at their desk. There are things like elastic bands that could go around chair legs or desk legs that would give a student an opportunity to move by pushing against the bands, give them movement opportunities. It could be that they have a secret word or a secret signal that they establish with the teacher when they can't sit still any longer and they need to get up and move to the back of the classroom. Maybe there's a signal that they can share to indicate to the teacher that they need to get up and go to the back of the room. Or maybe they can have a pass that they can keep in their desk, and when they need to move around, maybe a pass that would let them go to the office and come back. There are all kinds of accommodations that you could come up with for dealing with movement issues. Regarding impulsivity and impulsive actions or poor decision making, some accommodations you might use for that are to change this, give them an exception to the school rules. So when the child enters school, their parents are given a handbook or are told about the handbook that can be accessed online. The school handbook shows all the school policies and procedures in there and their school rules. Well, sometimes students with attention deficit disorder who do have a problem with impulsivity may break rules that are more difficult for them to follow than typical children. So they might need some accommodations to the rules. So if things are written in the handbook, like if they talk out of turn in class, they get a demerit or something, you might have to make an exception for that on their IEP to show that, you know, there might be consequences, but they're not going to be punished because of their disability. So I don't know if you've had this session yet in Compass on behavior intervention and supports. Have they had that session, Carrie? So in that session, you talked about manifestation determinations when students have gotten into disciplinary problems and they've had some suspensions or expulsions, and a manifestation determination is required after 10 days of that, where the IEP team has to meet to decide whether or not the behavior is related to the student's disability. Well, in those kinds of impulsive acts where a student might be breaking school rules, if it's related to their impulsivity, that is definitely related to their disability of attention deficit disorder. So that's where you would advocate for a student in those circumstances. Next slide, Carrie. So as I mentioned earlier, any of those disabilities that are under the category of emotional disability are things that can't be diagnosed by a school district. Those are all medical diagnoses, and they can only be determined by a medical professional, like a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist or a pediatrician or a neurologist. So those individuals would need to provide the diagnosis to the school district to be considered in the IEP development. So when we think about inattention, we're thinking about problems like becoming easily distracted by things in their visual field or things in their hearing field. Like I said, things outside the window or out in the hallway. They fail to pay close attention to details and make careless mistakes. They rarely follow directions carefully, a lot of times because they haven't heard the whole set of directions. They lose or forget school books and other things that are needed to finish a task. And they often skip from one activity to another without finishing it. So a lot of times people are confused when a child is identified with attention deficit disorder because they may know the kid and they may know that they can play video games for 4 and 5 hours at a time without stopping and pay attention to all of that, but they can't pay attention in school. Well, the reason for that is because video games are a multi-sensory experience. They've got the visual field in front of them. They're hearing the action. They're emotionally involved in the action, and so it's using all of their senses. So it's blocking out a lot of those other things. Plus, it's highly motivating because it's a game and it's something that they're usually successful at. And so the success keeps them motivated and keeps them engaged. And so just because a child is able to pay attention to a video game for hours at a time doesn't mean they don't have attention deficit disorder. Their hyperactivity makes them seem like they are driven by a motor. They run instead of walking. They may talk incessantly. They might touch other people. when it's inappropriate. They can be fidgety, hard to sit still, tap their pencil. So some of the accommodations you have for that, or there are devices you can get that will allow them to tap without making any noise. It can be difficult for them to sit in a chair or listen to a story for very long. So another accommodation could be sitting on a balance ball. That's something that engages their core and engages their muscles, and so can help with the movement issues if they're sitting on a balance ball instead of in a regular chair. It, giving them the opportunity to run off, so here is one of your advocacy issues. Sometimes kids with ADD are punished or are uh, denied recess because of some of their behavior. And so that makes their hyperactivity that much worse. You know, keeping withholding recess opportunities from a student with ADD is just a recipe for disaster, because that's one of the things that can help them get out some of their hyperactivity or energy. So that's a good advocacy issue also. Impulsivity involves being unable to curb their immediate reaction. They're often seem emotionally reactive or negative, and uh, they students with ADD frequently are emotionally immature. So many times they have trouble making friends because they speak impulsively, they interrupt, they blurt out answers, they act without thinking, they have a hard time waiting for their turn. And so many times children with ADD often have friends that are younger than them because of their emotional immaturity. And so they frequently have trouble making friends that are their own age. They also can engage in risky activity without thinking of the consequences. So they're more accident prone and more likely to do things that are dangerous. Conduct disorder is another one of the emotional disabilities, and that refers to a group of behavioral and emotional problems. And those can be exhibited by aggression to people or animals, destruction of property, deceitfulness or lying, stealing, running away, truancy. So these are more serious psychiatric issues. So students that have conduct disorders need to receive therapeutic kinds of services. So often they will be seeing professionals outside of the school setting, like getting psychiatric care or regular appointments with the psychiatrist along with medication. So it would be important when advocating for students that have a conduct disorder to include the recommendations of the professionals that are working with those students. So, how they're different from typical kids, they are consistently troubling to others, not just isolated incidents like all kids are going to have trouble with conflicts with other people at some time or another. But for kids that have conduct disorder, it's just an ongoing, um, very, very frequent occurrence. And the behaviors are more extreme outside the normal range. And uh, in and they could be in response to things that typical kids just take in stride. So the treatment for conduct disorders involves medical professionals. So, but evaluating them to see if there are other underlying problems like learning disabilities or attention deficit disorder, if they've been subject to child abuse, those those kinds of problems need to be evaluated, or, there a good social history needs to be conducted to see whether these are events that happened in their life that contribute to the development of their condition. Behavior therapy can be helpful, but that again would be by a medical professional, like a psychiatrist. And behavior and family therapy tends to be long-term, ongoing, and getting early therapy offers the best hope for a good long-term outcome. But again, those would involve professionals in the medical field. Oppositional defiant disorder is another one of the emotional disabilities. It's a pattern of uncooperative, defiant, and hostile behavior towards authority figures that seriously interferes with the child's daily functioning. Many parents who have children with ODD report that their child was more rigid and demanding at an early age. And so it's something that usually shows up at a young age. And so again, when you're looking for IEP accommodations for kids with these kind of psychiatric disorders, it's helpful to have professional recommendations from those medical professionals. Treatment for oppositional defiant disorder includes comprehensive evaluation. Again, looking for any underlying problems or coexisting disorders. Parent training programs are most helpful because these children are so defiant to any kind of authority. It's helpful for parents to go through a training program that helps them know how to work with their child at home. And then individual psychotherapy helps children with anger management. That's again a psychiatric professional. And then in the school setting, helping, a school social worker often will be involved. A school social worker or another counselor, a school-related counselor, might need to have individual sessions with the student to help them with anger management strategies. And then cognitive behavior therapy is another tool that's used for children with ODD. The next disability we'll talk about is autism spectrum disorder. And autism as a spectrum disorder means that it covers a huge array of effect among. So people often say, if you know one child with autism, you know one child with autism, because the spectrum is so comprehensive. You can go from a child that has significant autism and intellectual disabilities to all the way to the other end of the spectrum for a child that has no intellectual disability but has significant social deficits. So, and anything in between. So autism is quite a large range, but it is a developmental disability, and it affects social interaction and verbal and nonverbal communication. And it's generally evident before the age of 3. And for students in school, it adversely affects their educational performance. So when we say verbal and nonverbal communication, some students with autism can speak as well as anyone, but they may have difficulty with using language to communicate. That they can speak well and articulate well, but may not be able to retrieve the words they need when they need them, all the way to other students with autism who may not be able to speak at all and need to use communication devices. So autism affects more boys than girls, and it can occur with other disabilities. So students with autism can also have learning disabilities, or they might have attention deficit disorder. Angelman syndrome and Rett syndrome are two other types of autism that are on the spectrum. And I think this statistic is outdated. The 1 in 59, I'm not sure what it is now. I think it is less than that. Now, Carrie, do you know what the current statistic is for
I'm not sure
the
what the current
prevalence?
one, yeah, I'm not sure what the current is, but it seems like it is less than 1 in 59.
Yeah, that needs to be updated. I'm not sure what it currently is, but I'm pretty certain it's more than 1 in 59. And autism for several years has been the fastest growing um, category of disability. So the eligibility standards for autism in order to be eligible for an IEP under the category of autism is that it has to be demonstrated before the age of 3, difficulty relating to others or interacting in a socially appropriate manner, the absence, delay, or disorder in verbal or nonverbal communication, and any one or more of the following. And the following includes insistence on sameness, unusual preoccupations, resistance to change, and unusual responses to sensory stimuli. So, insistence on sameness, some examples of that are when a student might have a meltdown if the daily schedule changes in the classroom. So, certain things happen at certain points of the day. And if um, one week they have a field trip or they have an assembly or something that interrupts that schedule, the student might have a meltdown because they're not following that rigid schedule. Unusual preoccupations could be things that they focus on to an extent that makes it difficult for them to maintain social relationships. So if they have a preoccupation with, well, we have up or Family Matters has a book in their library called Just Given the Whale, which was written by um, Patrick Schwartz and Paula Cluthy about a little boy that was in kindergarten, a little boy with autism who was preoccupied with whales. And he just needed to talk about whales all the time and would have a meltdown if he didn't get to talk about whales. And so in their book, they showed how his teacher incorporated whales into arithmetic and into social studies and into reading and into all the areas of. So in the book, the little boy, I think if I remember, it's been a while since I looked at the book, but if I remember, he had a meltdown because someone took his his stuffed whale, away from him. And he had a meltdown and he crawled under the table in the classroom. And um, so when they just let him hold on to his whale, he was perfectly fine sitting in a chair, sitting at his desk. So his classmates had to learn that it was okay for him to carry his whale around with him. So using those unusual preoccupations, so that's one of maybe your advocacy strategies when you're working with a family that has a child with autism who is getting in trouble either socially or academically because of their preoccupation with something. How you can incorporate that preoccupation into their daily events could help them be more successful in the classroom. Resistance to change would be things like the change in the class schedule that we talked about. And unusual responses to sensory stimuli would include things like if sounds that wouldn't bother typical people, like sometimes fluorescent lights make a buzzing noise. And for typical people, you might not even notice that buzzing sound, but a child who uh, is has a sensory issues with sound, it could be the loudest thing that they hear and might interrupt their thinking or their ability to pay attention. And so, uh, for other students, it might be touch. They might overreact to being touched, or uh, might be overreactive to another student that touches them accidentally. So those would be unusual responses to sensory stimuli.
Okay, I looked up those stats, Deb, and it looks like it's 1 in 36 currently.
Okay.
So that did change significantly. There is a
Yeah.
question. Jamie wanted to know, would a neuropsychological evaluation be more appropriate for those with ADHD, ODD, autism, etc., as opposed to a regular psychological evaluation?
Well, a neuropsychological evaluation is always going to provide more information than another kind of than a just a regular evaluation. Whether a student actually needs a neuropsychological, that is dependent on a lot of factors. And so, if in I guess the easiest way to answer that would be to say, if a typical evaluation, a school evaluation, or just a regular medical evaluation doesn't provide the answers that you need or all the information you need about how a student learns or how a student's disability affects them, then that would be the time to advocate for a neuropsychological. Okay, the next category, were there any other questions, Carrie?
Not at this time.
Okay, but maybe a few more words about the neuropsychological. Um, a lot of times parents want a neuropsychological evaluation, and those, of course, are going to be more expensive than a typical evaluation. And usually, school districts do not have neuropsychologists on staff. And so they're going to typically balk at paying for an evaluation like that. So, as an advocate, you would have to make a case for why that is needed. You'd have to help the family to make a case for how that's needed. And so, um, and to do that, you would have to give the school district an opportunity to do an evaluation and then help them see how more information is needed if that's not adequate to plan services for a student. So the next eligibility category we're going to talk about is intellectual disability. So intellectual disability is characterized by significantly impaired intellectual functioning, existing concurrently with deficits in adaptive behavior and manifested during the developmental period. So, in other words, an intellectual disability is not something that's going to happen to a person after they've gone through all their child development stages. So, it's not going to be something that's going to be identified as an adult unless it is part of an adult condition like dementia or something like that. So, when we talk about intellectual disabilities, we talk about impaired intellectual functioning in combination with impaired adaptive behavior. So sometimes this is important because sometimes kids who have not had adequate instruction, maybe because they have been highly mobile and moved a lot throughout their childhood and never have stayed in one school long enough to get good consistent instruction, or maybe because of they're an English language learner, or maybe because of their home life, or uh, a history of child abuse or something like that, may appear to be intellectually impaired because they don't have the intellectual skills that kids that typical of their age have, but their adaptive behavior may be perfectly normal. So adaptive behavior are things that you're able to do to take care of yourself, which would include grooming and uh, being able to communicate with people, being able to talk, to listen, to follow directions, to take care of yourself. So sometimes students might score low on an intelligence test and look like they have some intellectual disability, but on the adaptive behavior part, they may score in the normal ranges. So that would mean they don't qualify for having an intellectual disability, because a student with an intellectual disability will have delays in both areas. So sub-average intellectual functioning is defined as an IQ of 70 or below on an IQ test. And IQ tests are different from the kinds of tests that kids take in school to measure their progress, or to group tests that are given to determine how a student compares to other students their age in their classroom. These tests are individually given and are individually scored. So the most common ones used in school are usually the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, the WISC. That's the one we most often see being used in schools. Adaptive behavior, as I said, those are everyday behaviors necessary for personal independence and social responsibility. So examples are your daily living skills, eating skills, grooming, toileting, being able to take a bus, use money, communicate your needs to others, your socialization, being able to work with others, to make friends, to understand social cues. So all of those kinds of things are considered adaptive behavior. So a student with intellectual impairments is going to have delays both in their thinking ability and in their adaptive behavior. The onset age is before age 18. So what happens if someone has a severe motorcycle accident and gets a brain injury at age 21? They would not be considered intellectually impaired. They would be considered to have a traumatic brain injury. And a traumatic brain injury can result in delays or deficits in intellectual functioning, but it's still considered a traumatic brain injury. Developmental delay is another category that in Illinois we use for students that are ages 3 to 9. And so children that have developmental delays are identified as having delays in one or more of these 5 areas: physical development, cognitive development, which is thinking, communication development, social emotional skills, and adaptive development. So if they have delays in any of those 5 areas, but we don't have reason to think they might have an intellectual impairment, they can qualify for an individualized education program under this category of developmental delay. And it's a good category to use for young children because many times children in early childhood can have delays to other children their age, but many times with some services, they can catch up and then eventually be on target for their age level and then won't need an IEP or a disability category beyond developmental delay. Specific learning disability is another category that includes things like math disabilities, reading disabilities, listening disabilities, and it's the largest category for children in special education. So children who are receiving special education services with an IEP, the bulk of those children have learning disabilities. I think it's usually about 70%. It's more than half of all children in special education are identified with those disabilities. So it involves problems in learning to read, do math, and write. So the federal definition of a specific learning disability and the definition that Illinois uses is a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, either spoken or written, that may manifest itself in an imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. So it includes conditions like dyslexia, dysgraphia. Dyslexia is a reading disability. Dysgraphia is a writing disability, and developmental dysphagia, which is a language disability. So things that might be affected by a specific learning disability are a student's listening comprehension. So they might have trouble retaining and using oral information, following directions, conversation, and discussions. So that is a processing problem they have in their brain. So if they may have a good understanding of language, but they might have trouble taking in oral information and processing it. Either it might take them a long time to understand what they've heard, and so they might need additional time with assignments or with instructions. Or they might have difficulty with word recall in making conversation or in discussions. So that is a listening comprehension disability. They might have trouble with oral expression where they can think and understand something very well, but they might not be able to express it orally. They might be able to write it, but they might not be able to recall the words or use vocabulary to the same extent that typical kids can. They might have trouble with basic reading skills to recognize and analyze words. They might have trouble with letter identification or sound symbol correspondence and reading fluency. So some children may be able to identify single words, but may have trouble being a fluent reader. They may struggle to read words and then to put together all the words that they just read and understand what they mean. And so those are problems that are typical of students that have dyslexia. And then some students have trouble with reading comprehension, which is different from they may be able to read fluently out loud and might be able to read a whole page of text flawlessly, but not understand a word of what they read. So and you would know that because they would have the inability to paraphrase or to draw conclusions about what they just read. Then written expression is manifested in being able to form letters, words, basic sentence structure and organization, and being able to express ideas and opinions in writing. And that could be because they don't understand the morphology of language, that certain letters go with certain sounds, And so they may write phonetically, or they may write in ways that where words are all completely spelled incorrectly. Or they may they may be able to do an oral book report very successfully, but to do one in writing would be impossible. Some students have trouble with mathematical calculations. They can't perform operations like addition, multiplication, and math fluency. And so some accommodations they might need are, they may never be able to memorize the times table. So they may have to always use calculator in math. Accommodations like that. Mathematical reasoning, they might have trouble with problem solving. They may not understand word problems, or they may not understand how to use money or to read graphs and tables. So some accommodations would be, some strategies that would help them with visual cues, or extra, they might need extended instruction, more instruction beyond what typical kids would need. Another learning disability could include speech and language impairments. And this would maybe not manifest itself in their speaking ability or their articulation ability. They might be able to pronounce words well, but they might have trouble with fluency, with things like stuttering, or being able to use word retrieval. So it takes them a long time to say what they're thinking, because they may have a lot of pauses between words as they're trying to retrieve the words. Or it may be that they don't have as much language, as much vocabulary, as much knowledge of vocabulary and language as other kids have. It could be articulation, which would be problems with pronouncing words, or it could be just their voice modality, modulation, or how they use their voice. So all of those things could be addressed with services by a speech and language therapist. Traumatic brain injury is something we talked about a little bit earlier, that it's something that happens to after over age 21, if someone is in an accident and it impairs their intellectual functioning, they might have symptoms similar to somebody with intellectual disabilities, but it's caused from a brain injury and not from an innate cognitive disability. Some physical symptoms of a mild head injury could be dizziness, headaches, balance problems, muscle weakness, endurance, numbness and tingling in body parts. It could be hearing loss, ringing in ears, double vision, smell or taste. So a head injury can happen to someone at any age. So a student who is under age 21 could still be involved in some kind of either an automobile accident or a playground accident or a swimming pool accident or something that causes a head injury that would cause these kinds of problems. What makes the needs of a student with a traumatic head injury different from other students is that frequently students or individuals, people, recover from head injuries. And so they may need more frequent evaluations, because some brain cells can be regenerated, and they can have therapies and services that might help them regain some of the skills they lose during a mild head injury. So one of the accommodations they might need is more frequent evaluation. Some behavioral cognitive symptoms of a head injury would be memory problems, inability to express oneself clearly, could be personality changes, could be sleep disturbances, could be avoidance behaviors, anxiety, difficulty understanding directions or questions, or uncharacteristic speech or behavior. These are all things that would require some accommodations. So that's where advocacy would come in for children with a brain injury, is getting them some appropriate accommodations for these kinds of symptoms. They frequently might miss school for a period of time while they're getting medical services. And then in order to return to school, they would need an assessment to see where their cognitive and adaptive levels are when they return to school. They're going to obviously be different from when they left school prior to the brain injury. So that assessment would identify potential pitfalls to learning, the appropriate learning environment, and address social pragmatics and peer issues. So social pragmatics would be, your social skills for day-to-day interactions with your peers. Visual impairment is another category, and that is a spectrum again. That's one of the spectrum disorders, because children can, and when we talk about visual impairments, we're not talking about kids that wear glasses and that have, typical nearsighted or farsighted that can be corrected with eyeglasses. And then if they wear their glasses, they can just, do fine in school. They don't need any additional accommodations or services. We're talking about kids that have visual impairments that even with glasses are going to impact their ability to perform in school. So they might need enlarged print, or they might need devices that magnify materials for them, or they might need braille materials if they're blind. Or so there are different categories of visual impairment, including total blindness, functional blindness, legal blindness, and low vision. And so each of those categories are going to need different kinds of accommodations. But students who have difficulty accomplishing visual tasks, even with prescribed corrective lenses, are going to need low vision services. And so they might need some support from a low vision professional who might come to school to design some, specially designed accommodations for them, like using some of the assistive technology tools that are available to help people with vision loss. And they might need some environmental accommodations. And again, those would be developed in cooperation with a specialist, like a itinerant vision specialist. So vision is the unifying sense for understanding the world. So for babies, infants and toddlers, it really is a developmental crisis, because they are not going to learn from the world the way that typical infants and toddlers do, who can see their caregivers and can see their surroundings and can interact with and learn social cues and can learn to identify things around them. For school-age children, it involves delays in reading rates because they can't see their materials. For adolescents, this is an area where adolescents that have visual impairments are at a greater risk for depression. And for adults with vision issues, it affects their employment rate. They are unemployed at a higher rate. So some of the kinds of services or some of the issues that we would look at for students with visual impairments would be orientation and mobility services are one of the related services students can get in an IEP. And that involves things like using a white cane and learning how to navigate environments and, being either using a wheelchair or using a white cane or some kind of tools to help them move and learn their environment. And that would be provided, those services would be provided by an orientation and mobility specialist. Compensatory skills, so learning other ways to get information besides through the visual sense. Social skills, they are going to often need help developing social skills because they're missing one of their sensory modalities for doing that. Independent living, they'll need help with that. Career education, visual efficiency, recreation and leisure, and assistive technology. All of those things would be considered in IEPs for students with visual impairments. And then, of course, assistive technology, that should be considered. Well, assistive technology should be discussed for all students, but we know that students with visual impairments are going to have a high need for assistive technology devices. So it could be optical devices that are just like magnifying lenses, talking calculators, book stands, line guides, other kinds of adapted equipment. They might need text-to-speech software for a computer. They might need other high-tech devices like computer software, like JAWS, computer software that enlarges text, or they might need closed captioning, those kinds of technology services. Other things they might need that are non-optical adaptations would be like they might need brighter lighting or more contrast between their materials, like light print on a dark background or dark print on a light background, or they might need accommodations for distance. They might need to be in the front row of the classroom, closer to the class, the chalkboard. They might need adaptations in size of print. They might need aids like book stands, low vision pens or pencils. There are tools that look like pens or pencils that can scan lines of text and turn it into auditory material for a student. They might need different kinds of bold lined paper or line guides. They might need additional time for assignments or preferential seating. Those are all the kinds of things you would advocate for. Hearing impairment is another category, and that includes, again, a spectrum from students that have mild hearing loss all the way to students that are deaf. So hearing loss is measured in decibels by loss in frequency, but that would be determined by a professional. The prevalence of hearing loss is about 1.4% of the children served in special education. So it's a low incidence disability. About 1 in 1,000 children are identified. And the Centers for Disease Control estimates that up to 15% of all children experience some degree of hearing loss. I am a person that had a hearing loss my entire life, and so it affected me in school. And I use hearing aids now, but I didn't when I was in school, but I needed some accommodations. So how does hearing loss affect a child's learning? Well, children that don't hear are obviously not going to develop speech and language in the same way that hearing children will develop those skills. It affects social emotional development because they have difficulty understanding others' use of pragmatics, which would include things like sarcasm, jokes, idioms, or intonation. They might, they're not going to catch the way a person says something, or they may not understand a joke or something that is not meant literally. They're going to have delays in academic areas because of their reading and written language issues. So they're going to need accommodations and modifications in all those areas. And they may have different ways of communicating. And so the kinds of things listed on this slide are the oral, they may use oral language only. There are different groups of people that have different views of how children who are deaf should contribute to the hearing world. And, you know, for some, there's the deaf community who thinks that there's a whole separate deaf culture, and they use sign language only and don't believe in using any assistive technology or any devices that might improve hearing ability. And then there are other people who feel that children who are deaf need to learn to use oral language as well as sign language. So there are kind of different groups of uh, beliefs about what's appropriate for students who are deaf. And that's something that may come up and for students with those issues. But there are a continuum of educational options. So some children who are deaf go to specialized schools for children who are deaf. And in Illinois, we have the Illinois State Board of Ed sponsored programs at the Illinois School for the Deaf and the Illinois School for the Blind. And so some students may be in those separate programs for their entire school careers. Other children with hearing or vision impairments may be included in general education classrooms and use a lot of assistive technology and have a lot of accommodations and modifications. There is, I don't know if you've had the assistive technology session yet in Compass, but if you have, you know that there is an explosion of technology out there that can help people with all kinds of disabilities. And so there's new digital hearing aids that are coming out every year. There's improvement in those. There are cochlear implants that can restore hearing for deaf individuals. There are telecommunication devices, there's closed captioning, there's a lot of technology that will help people with hearing and vision problems. So this is what I referred to earlier. There's a lot of debate over what's the appropriate approach for students that have deafness, whether it's the oral versus sign debate. And so that is really something that is individualized to the family. We have another category that is called deaf blindness, because obviously students who are deaf or students who are blind have another sense that they can rely on, which is going to help them use accommodations and modifications, and is going to give them a lot more ability to learn. But students who are dually affected by deafness and blindness obviously have much more significant barriers to learning. And so we have a separate category for those students. And so they are going to need, a lot of services from professionals that can deal with those sensory issues. And then the last eligibility category is other health impairment, which includes things like asthma, ADHD. Sometimes ADHD is considered an emotional disability. Sometimes, in its milder forms, it's considered just to be other health impairment. Kids with diabetes, epilepsy, hemophilia, leukemia, cancer, other medical conditions that might affect a child's educational performance and don't fit into any of those other categories might get services under other health impairments. So a child who has other health impairments has chronic or acute health problems that impair learning and indicate a need for special education. So if it's a student that has ADHD, it might be their impaired organizational or work skills. That means they need some accommodations or modifications. Their inability to manage or complete tasks could be from health issues or ADHD, could be from conditions like cancer, where they're undergoing treatment that impairs their thinking or their ability. It could be problems that come from excessive health-related absenteeism. So students that have health issues, significant health issues, might have to miss a lot of school, and therefore they're going to have interruptions in their learning, might need some home school services temporarily or during hospitalizations, and also might require medications that might have an impact on their cognitive functioning, or might cause drowsiness or sleepiness that impairs their ability to pay attention. So those would be accommodations that would have to be considered when you're developing an IEP. So orthopedic impairments I said that other health impaired was the last category, but we still have orthopedic impairments. That's physical disabilities. So students that, have, may require a wheelchair because they're of mobility issues. The orthopedic impairments result in deficits in quality, speed, or accuracy of movement that impairs learning. Could be from congenital anomalies like birth defects, or it could be from disease, or it could be from conditions like cerebral palsy that affect their muscles or their stamina or their movement. So cerebral palsy is a condition that involves motor impairments. It could be as simple as coordination problems to something as significant as inability to use any of their limbs, their arms or legs, in their you need to be in a wheelchair and need all kinds of assistive technology to access materials. But some people with cerebral palsy might only have coordination issues that make walking uh, just a little delayed, or maybe they might not be able to participate in PE the same way other kids could, or they might need more time to navigate a hallway. So what we've talked about today with these disabilities are a lot of different needs, but there are a lot of resources out there. And that was a list of some websites you can go to. And in the materials that are in your Google Drive for tonight, have a lot of resources for accommodations and modifications. And so I really encourage you to read your materials and look at those, and to save them and keep them for later reference. So let's see. Should we take a 5-minute break between the two PowerPoints?
Yeah, we can do that. So,
okay, let's take a 5-minute break. It's 7:14. So we'll come back to the next PowerPoint at 7:19.
Okay.
Okay. It's raining.
All right, it is 7:19, so we will go ahead and get started.
Okay, the next half of the session tonight is going to be information about methodology and IEPs and research-based interventions. So, as you know, the Individuals with Disabilities Act requires that students be taught whenever possible using research-based interventions. And so we'll be giving you more information about how that applies to decisions that are made in special education. So an overview of this presentation, we'll be talking about how methodology and IEPs were used pre-1999, and then what happened with case law that then changed the regulations in the reauthorization in 2004. And then we'll be talking about methodology across contexts, like with independent educational evaluations, early intervening services, and different disability groups. So can methodology be included in IEPs? I retired in September after 33 years of advocating for students with disabilities. And when I first started advocating for students with disabilities 33 years ago, you couldn't even talk about methodology. Methodology was considered to be a purview of the school district, and parents had no say in what kind of methodology was used with their children. So it was really unclear in the regulations that methodology could be talked about at all until 1999. And then it was added as a prong of specially designed instruction in the 1999 reauthorization. So yes, methodology can be included in IEPs. Now, it's not always appropriate to talk about methodology in an IEP, but we're going to get to when it is. So specially designed instruction is something that an IEP is supposed to provide to a student with disability. And SDIs, or specially designed instruction, means adapting as appropriate to the needs of an eligible child, the content, the methodology, or the delivery of instruction to address the unique needs of the learner to ensure access to the general curriculum. We don't have the full words there. This is from the federal law, but you can see methodology is actually written into the law. And delivery of instruction is what we consider specially designed instruction to be, those accommodations and modifications that we're designing in IEPs for kids. So in 1999, what the legislators said was, in light of the legislative history and case law, it's clear that in developing an IEP, that methodology, which will be used as an integral part of what is individualized about a student's education, in those circumstances will need to be discussed at the IEP meeting and incorporated into the student's IEP. So, for example, a child with a learning disability who has not learned to read using traditional instructional methods might need an appropriate education. An appropriate education may require some other instructional strategy. So what that means is, it used to be you couldn't even say the word dyslexia when you were talking about kids with reading disabilities. School districts wouldn't allow you to even use that word. Well, now, we have, our Illinois State Board of Education has a dyslexia handbook that is available to all Illinois educators. And so dyslexia now is recognized as something that requires specific methodologies for students with reading disabilities. Other students' IEPs may not need to address instructional method. So, in other words, just because a child is eligible for an IEP doesn't mean that they're going to need specific methodology. So if they are able to learn with the appropriate accommodations and modifications and the instructional strategies that are used with the general curriculum, then they don't need a specific methodology. It's only in the cases where, there's something specific like autism, a student with autism who needs ABA therapy, or a student with a reading disability who needs multi-sensory based reading instruction. Those are the cases where you'll talk about methodology. So case law recognizes that instructional methodology can be an important consideration in the context of what constitutes an appropriate education for a child with disability. At the same time, courts have indicated they will not substitute a parentally preferred methodology for sound educational programs. So, in other words, just because you have heard about something new and you think the school should try it with your child doesn't necessarily mean that the school district has to substitute what you want for what they're using with your child. If your child is making adequate progress with the tools that they're using or the instructional curriculum that they're using, then you don't have a case for requesting a different kind of methodology. There's been some court cases. This is one, Deal versus Hamilton County, where there was a due process hearing over whether the school district needed to provide LOVAS or ABA or the TEACH curriculum. So what the court said was there was a point at which the difference in outcomes between two methods can be so great that the provision of the lesser program could amount to a denial of a free, appropriate public education. So when there is a huge difference like that, then that is evidence and a warrant for using the curriculum that the parent wants. If it's not a significant difference between those programs, then it would be up to what the school district is prepared to use. But the court did say a one-size-fits-all approach to special education will not be countenanced by the IDEA. So all of these decisions about curriculum and in research-based intervention have to be individually based on what a child needs. So what I mean by that is you can't say that all children with autism are going to get ABA therapy, because not all children with autism are going to need ABA therapy, or not all children that have a learning disability are going to need a multisensory reading curriculum, because some children with dyslexia or with learning disabilities may not even have a reading disability. They may have a math disability or a writing disability and don't need a special reading curriculum. There was a groundbreaking court case called Rowley in 1982 that had to do with methodology. And so what it said was that children who are eligible for special education services are entitled to receive only services based on an appropriately constructed and legally compliant IEP that provides some educational benefit. So this case, what people remember about this case is the Chevrolet versus Cadillac analogy. So what the courts basically said is, there are Cadillac programs that would provide optimal development to certain people, but a school district is not obligated to provide the Cadillac services. They just need to provide the Chevrolet services. It'll get you what you need, get you going where you need, but not in as much comfort as a Cadillac. So they don't have to provide the absolute best. They have to provide what's appropriate and what helps the student make more than just minimal or trivial progress. So that was the Rowley case. And the Rowley case was actually a child who was hearing impaired, and the school district was providing some cued language service. I don't remember what all kinds of services they were providing, but the child was making good progress in school, but her parents wanted her to have sign language instruction. And so they were requesting a specific methodology. But the services the school district was providing was helping the child to make adequate progress. So that was the standard for determining what were appropriate services for children for many, many years. The Rowley case was the standard. And so more recently, I don't know how many years ago it's been now, we had the Andrew F. case, and you may have learned about this case in some of your other sessions. But what the court ruled in the Andrew F. case was that Andrew F. was a student who was not making progress in school over many years' time. He had the same IEP with the same goals and objective for years at a time and never made any progress on them. So his parents took him out of school and put him in a private school where they were better at understanding his behavior. He had an emotional disability, and they understood his behavior better. They were better able to develop a behavior intervention plan. And he made really, really good progress in the private school. And so this case went all the way to the Supreme Court and really changed the standards for how we look at IEPs now. So that what the Supreme Court said was that all children should have the opportunity to meet challenging objectives. And so they recognized that that child's IEP at the public school, before his parents put him in the private school, the same IEP year after year with no progress, that was not making progress that allowed him to advance from grade to grade, and it wasn't giving him challenging objectives. And so they ruled in favor of the parents, and the school district had to pay for those private school services. So being reasonably calculated to make progress means that the school district needs to use research-based interventions that are proven to work for children with that type of disability. And that will give them access to challenging objectives that help keep them learning and making positive growth. So the Pope case was about methodology as well. And the judge in this case said that where self-sufficiency is a realistic goal for a child, a program that maximizes the possibility of self-sufficiency could be required. So, in what the way Andrew F. addressed that in their decision was they said, to make progress in light of a child's circumstances, I think is the word they used. Well, circumstances is their, ability to learn. So if a student who has a learning disability, which means that they have at least average intelligence, that means they're capable of learning. So if they're not increasing their skills or learning from the instruction that the school is providing, then that means it's inappropriate and they need to consider some additional or different kind of instruction. The Individuals with Disabilities Educate Act specifically indicates the fact that a child is receiving passing grades and advancing from grade to grade, or hasn't been retained or held back in a grade, is not by itself evidence that the child is receiving a free appropriate public education. And so I'd like you to think about children that are what we call twice exceptional, because you see this, when I was doing advocacy, I saw this come up a lot, where students who are gifted intellectually, but also have a learning disability, which makes it more difficult for them to learn using the materials in the way that the school provides them. So if they have gifted intelligence, and yet they're maybe getting passing grades like D's in all of their classes at school, is that making progress appropriate in light of their circumstances? I would say not, because they have the intellectual capacity to learn at a higher level if they have the appropriate accommodations and modifications. So what happens sometimes as an advocate, you have a child that's twice exceptional, the school district says they are passing, they're making passing grades, but they're still not learning to their potential. So sometimes schools can be unwilling to make accommodations and modifications when children can make passing grades, but yet they're not using that gifted intellectual capacity that they have. So that's where you can use this provision of the law that says passing grades and advancing from grade to grade does not necessarily mean they're getting a free appropriate public education. They're not working to their ability. So in the reauthorization in IDEA 2004, in the commentary portion of the law, they the legislators said that over 30 years of research supporting high quality intensive pre-service preparation and professional development for all personnel who work with children with disabilities in order to ensure that such personnel have the skills and knowledge necessary to improve the academic achievement and functional performance of children with disabilities, including the use of scientifically based instructional practices to the maximum extent possible. So this is a very strong provision that requires educators to have ongoing professional development to make sure that they're learning about scientifically based instructional practices. So they're, they specifically mention scientifically based early reading programs, positive behavioral interventions and supports, and early intervening services. So those are things that we can advocate for. That if children aren't learning, we want to make sure that we're looking at what curriculum is being used, and is there scientific research that shows it's effective for children with those kinds of disabilities? Are those positive behavior interventions things that have a research behind them to show they're effective? If they're not working, then we have to go back to the drawing board and we have to advocate for different kinds of supports. Early intervening services is a provision in the law that allows school districts to use a tiny portion of their special education funding to work with students who are not yet identified as eligible for special education. So that would be in like response to intervention in multi-tiered systems of supports, where they use RTI to provide some extra help to kids who are just struggling in school. So that's so early intervening services are something you could advocate for kids who don't have an IEP yet. So the full definition of the term scientifically based research includes that a peer-reviewed journal published the research, or that a panel of independent experts through a comparably rigorous, objective, and scientific review approved it. So how do you know whether a method has scientifically based research behind it? There are a lot of ways to find those things out. So we'll talk about some of those in a minute. But the IEP must include a statement of this is in the federal law, that the IEP must include a statement of the special ed and related services and supplementary aids and services that are based on peer-reviewed research to the extent practicable to be provided to the child. So, I mean, this language is all in the law. And so it is perfectly within a parent or an advocate's right to ask to see the research that shows a program is effective. Sometimes there isn't any. Sometimes there isn't any research on some of the kinds of things that we want to do, but we just want to show that there is progress. If there is progress using a particular method, then you wouldn't object to it to be continuing to be used. But if the child is not making progress, it's where you're going to want to ask about these kinds of things. Where a child has needs that go beyond the available time, training, or experience of the IEP team, the IEP should specify the additional supports that the staff will receive to be able to implement a program effectively. So a good example of this would be if a child needs sign language services and the teacher doesn't know sign language. How is she going to communicate, he or she going to communicate with the student if they don't know sign language services? So that might require training for the teacher. Or perhaps a teacher may never have had a student with autism in their class before. May need some support in some training about autism, or perhaps a teacher's aide is hired to work with a particular student that has autism or a specific disability, and that teacher's aide has no training or experience. So part of the IEP might include training for the paraprofessional or training for the teacher. Next slide, okay. Can methodology be included in independent educational evaluations? So nothing in the law requires that an evaluator make recommendations about specific methodologies or specific materials, but there is nothing that prohibits it either. So any decisions that are made regarding the content of the IEP on the basis of an evaluation, including methodologies or the use of specific materials, would have to be made by the IEP team as a result of considering the information presented. So the evaluator might have recommendations about effective methodologies that they could make in their report, or they could do, or they could present at the IEP meeting, and that would have to be considered by the team. So what about early intervening services? So that would be early intervening services are usually typically going to be found in RTI, or multi-tiered systems of support. I'm not sure whether you had that session yet during your Compass training, but you'll talk, if you haven't, you'll be talking about those things. And that requires professional development for teachers as well, so that if these extra services that are going to be provided in addition to what all the other students are getting, and might include some early intervening services paid for through special education funds, those services will have to be done with research-based effective strategies. So where do we most frequently see the need to include methodology in the IEP? That would be with hearing impairment and deafness, where we talked about those different schools of thought on whether students need to be immersed in sign language, or whether they need oral plus sign language, or whether they get cued or whatever. So those are areas where you're going to see methodology in the IEP. Students with emotional disabilities, where you're talking about behavior interventions. And so this is one of my common complaints, is so many children that have emotional disabilities have IEPs where their services are provided in a program that is a segregated school just for children with emotional disabilities. And in those schools, they frequently have a behavior system. It's a level system where they earn points and move up levels. And they use that system is used for every student in that school. What is individualized about that? I've never understood that. How putting all students with emotional disabilities in a school on a behavioral level system where they have to follow rules, and if you break rules, you lose points, and if you follow rules, you earn points. There's nothing individualized about that. I fail to see how that is appropriate for anyone, but that is just a personal bias that I have. So autism, whether a student needs applied behavior analysis, or LOVAS, or some other autism-related strategy. Learning disabilities, if students need multi-sensory learning programs or reading programs, those are where you typically see methodology addressed. Those are the most common times. So most common disputes over methodology would be method of communication for deaf children, applied behavior analysis therapy for kids with autism, and multisensory reading programs. So the unfortunate thing about these kind of disputes is for parents, a lot of times it's a very difficult, they have rights, and they, have all the dispute resolution safeguards that are available to them. But in order to, if you're having a disagreement with your school about these methodologies, what parents really, really need in order to get them and to prevail in a hearing is an expert witness. And that's costly. That's very costly for parents. So if you can intervene as an advocate, as a parent or an advocate, early by asking for an independent educational evaluation, a lot of times that can provide the support that you need in a methodology dispute. And I don't know if you had your session yet or if it's coming up about independent educational evaluations, but you'll get more information on that if you haven't already. Next slide. How do we know what is research-based? Well, there are a lot of resources that you can look into. These are some websites that you can go to. The What Works Clearinghouse, the top one on this list, is updated continually. That's something that is provided by the US Department of Education, or is funded by the US Department of Education, and it's continually updated. So it's a really, really good resource. And then some of these other, all of these are really good resources. And also you can, if you have concerns about curriculums that a child you're working with is using, a lot of times just going to the website for that curriculum company can get you to their, some of the research-based information. Was that the end of the PowerPoint, Carrie?
Yes, that was the end of that one.
Okay, so do you have that list of scenarios that we can go over in the last 10 minutes?
Yes, I'm getting ready to pull that up. Let me. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yeah, can you make it a little bigger?
So I'm trying to figure out,
You go up to that plus sign.
oh, okay. There we go.
There
Thank
you
you.
go. Okay, so were there any questions before I get started on these?
I don't see anything in the chat or Q&A right now.
Okay, so we only have 10 minutes left, but this is where audience participation comes in. So, like, raise your hand when, to express what you think about these. So we'll look at the first one. The first one says that Sarah is in second grade and she's learning how to read. She is classified as having a learning disability, so that's what her IEP eligibility is. And she is in the general ed classroom for reading. Her teacher is using a whole language approach to teaching the class to read. Sarah is not making any progress in her reading as by her test scores and her reading grades. It's nearing the end of the school year and Sarah has made no progress in reading since the end of first grade. Her parents think that Sarah needs a different reading program. The school says Sarah is a slow learner and she'll catch up in third grade. So what would you do in this case as an advocate?
You can feel free to raise your hand and I can allow you to talk. Or you can feel free to type in the chat as well.
Okay, well, if nobody's stepping up to speak up, let's go to
Jean,
the,
Jean raised
what?
her hand. You can go ahead, Jean.
Hi. I had four children, and one of them only could learn whole language. The other three learned phonetically. So I would, at the minimum, want them to try another methodology to teach her to read.
So you what? I'm sorry, I didn't get the last thing you said.
I would want them to try another methodology besides whole language. I would want them to at least try phonetics or
Yeah,
a
definitely.
specialized reading program.
Sure, because let's think about what how children learn and think about their stages of learning. So um, statistics show that children who don't learn to read by third grade have a pretty dismal outlook for the rest of their school career. So reading is really important in those first couple of grades because you learn to read in first through second grade, and in third grade, you start reading to learn. So it's really important not to wait for third grade for her to start getting some services. So the one thing, so something that parents could do is ask for an independent educational evaluation to show how she's learning. Another thing that she could do is request that the services she's getting be increased in intensity and in frequency. Since she's not making any progress, she hasn't made any progress since first grade. Obviously, there's a problem. So bringing the IEP team together to talk about what some strategies for either increasing her services, bringing in some RTI services, getting an independent educational evaluation, all of those things are going to help to determine what's appropriate for her learning program. Okay, the second one says Peter is in second grade and has an IEP. Peter has cerebral palsy and has difficulty in fine and gross motor skills, cannot walk independently, and has speech impairments. Peter does not have any cognitive impairments. A new facility has developed in the community for individuals with cerebral palsy. The intervention they offer is called conductive education, and that is a mix of intensive physical PT and occupational therapy, OT, in a group setting designed to increase the functional skills and subsequent independence of individuals with CP. Peter's making progress presently with the limited OT and PT he receives from, he's making no progress presently with the limited OT and PT he receives from the school. His parents are considering requesting the school to pay for Peter to receive conductive education. So what would you do as an advocate in this situation? Anybody want to speak up? Given the limited time that we have left, I'm just going to go ahead and look at this. So we don't know, reading this scenario, we don't know what the whether there's any peer-reviewed research regarding this conductive therapy, or conductive education. So that's going to be an important consideration here. I mean, a parent can't ask for something that is new and unproven and expect a school district to put out a significant amount of resources to pay for something that isn't evidence-based or research-backed. So that's going to be important to find out. And then this is another case where a parent could request an independent educational evaluation by, an outside OT and PT evaluators to see if they have some different recommendations from what the student is currently receiving. Okay, so the third one is Jenny is a kindergartner with autism. She's in a regular education classroom with her non-disabled peers. She's developing social skills by being around her non-disabled peers, but she's not making any progress academically from the classroom. Her parents also pay for ABA therapy at their home. Her parents feel that Jenny is making academic progress on the things that she is working on with her ABA therapist. Her parents want the school to offer ABA therapy during the day instead of offering the regular educational classroom. The school feels that removing Jenny from the regular education classroom is denying her LRE and refuses to offer the ABA. So, does anyone have their hand raised, Carrie? Okay, so we'll go ahead with this. So Jenny is making progress with social skills, being in the general education classroom. So it sounds like something that you would not want to take away from her. Her parents are concerned because she's not making progress academically. That doesn't necessarily mean she needs to be in a separate environment getting ABA therapy. She could, maybe there are components of ABA therapy that could be incorporated into the general education classroom, or we need to do a closer look at why she's not making academic progress. So again, maybe having an independent educational evaluation might benefit here, or just taking a closer look at what's going on academically might help, might have the IEP team come up with some better solutions for better instructional services. Okay, and the last one says, Jamie is a 4th grade student with Angelman syndrome. Last year, Jamie began using alphabet therapy, which is an instructional method designed for kids with Angelman syndrome to learn in the classroom. The IEP team feels that Jamie benefits from alphabet therapy and wants to continue to use it for the school year. Jamie's educational assistant, however, will not be returning this year. Jamie's educational assistant happened to be trained in alphabet therapy. Now the parents are worried that the educational assistant that Jamie gets will not be trained in this methodology. The school says they cannot assure the parents that the aide will be trained in alphabet therapy. So what would an advocate do in this case? Well, this is not a methodology that the parent is requesting. This is something that the school district already approved and is already using. And the student already has a history of making progress with this therapy. Now, because the aide is leaving, they're saying they can't guarantee that a new aide is going to be trained in this therapy. Well, this is pretty much a no-brainer. Probably, most likely, a new aide won't be trained in that therapy because it's not something that's very common. So the parents would be completely within their rights to ask for that aide to be trained. And ideally, they would ask for that training to happen over the summer before school starts. So the aide is trained by the time that school does begin. So we have 1 minute left. If anybody has any questions. And while we're waiting to see if there's any questions or hands raised, I'll just say I thank you for your attention tonight. And I also thank you for taking this journey to become a graduate of the Compass program. And good luck with your advocacy.
Yeah,
Any
thank
questions,
you.
Carrie?
I'm not seeing any questions right now. No one has their hand raised. There's nothing in chat or Q&A. So yeah, we really appreciate your dedication. So if you have any questions, feel free to email Abby or myself, and we'd be happy to help you. But there are no questions right now. So it's 8:01. We'll let you go.
All right. Good night, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Deb.
Thank you.